From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Former President Trump is not immune from prosecution in the 2020 election case brought by Jack Smith. That's according to a D.C. appellate court. Trump now has 6 days to appeal to the Supreme Court. We'll discuss with legal expert Jessica Roth.
Bipartisan border bill appears set for failure.
It's been made pretty clear to us by the Speaker that it will not become law.
But Democratic Senate leaders say they'll still hold a procedural vote on this tomorrow. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia will be with us.
Plus, the impeachment vote in the House against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is expected this hour, and House Republicans have little margin for error. We know, Joe, that they're working with a very small majority. You have 2 members who have already said they're no on impeaching Mayorkas. And while they're going to vote on that, and they are likely to vote on a standalone Israel aid package as well to the tune of more than $17 billion, doesn't look like the House, at least, is going to be voting on this border security deal. How
true. I guess we will get a cloture vote in the Senate tomorrow. It's gotten to the point now, though, where this is being called DOA in the House. That's been the case for days, leading many to wonder why the president took a minute to come out and speak to the American people as he did today, Kaylee. We brought that to our listeners and viewers earlier live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Here's Joe Biden.
All indications are this bill won't even move forward to the Senate floor. Why? A simple reason. Donald Trump. He'd rather weaponize this issue than actually solve it. So for the last 24 hours, he's done nothing, I'm told, but reach out to Republicans in the House and the Senate and threaten them and try to intimidate them to vote against this proposal. And it looks like they're caving.
We heard as well from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, no fan or friend of Donald Trump. He weighed in on the border deal today. Here he is.
There are other parts of this supplemental that are extremely important as well. Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. We still, in my view, ought to tackle the rest of it because it's important. Not that the border isn't important, but we can't get an outcome. So that's where I think we ought to head, up to Senator Schumer to decide how to repackage this.
Already talking about repackaging what we were told was a once-in-a-generation compromise. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, along with Jordan Fabian and Sarah Forden to cover all of our top stories. Wendy, let's begin with you in the Senate and I guess not the House of Representatives. To think how much this has changed. We're hearing, of course, a lot about Donald Trump here, but was there more to it than that? Were there sticking points that Democrat and Republican negotiators just didn't see?
No, is the short answer to that. I mean, sure, everyone is a little bit unhappy with the bill because it is a compromise.
That's the way it
in
works.
A narrowly divided Senate. And anyone who's been married more than a week knows that you must compromise. And if no one's happy, then it's a success, right? So this is this is where Congress is at. For decades, Congress has passed bills that no one is fully happy with so that the policy can move. Sure, it slows down a little in an election year, but we've never seen anything like this where the nominee, not even the incumbent, but the nominee for one party can say to Congress, don't pass this bill because then I don't have this issue to campaign on. Yeah. And they actually agree to it. It's really kind of stunning.
It's worth keeping in mind here that all of these members of the House also, except for the ones who have decided they are retiring, are seeking re-election and may also want to campaign on this issue for themselves, not just for the former president. Sure. But they also may want to campaign on perhaps impeaching the Homeland Security Secretary, because as Joe and I mentioned, Wendy, we are expecting that vote to take place this evening. There's, 3 Republican votes that Mike Johnson can afford to lose here to get this impeachment across the line, and you have 2 no's already. What happens if this vote fails? What does that signal about the functioning of the House?
It signals that they will really have egg on their face if they do this, because what they're saying is, we don't want to change the policy, But what we do want to do is impeach the guy who we could empower to change the policy if we pass this bill. But rather than pass this bill, we'll just try to impeach him, even though his impeachment is as dead in the Senate as the legislation is in the House.
It's pretty remarkable. Wendy Benjaminson, thank you, as always, for joining us. And now let's turn to Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, who covers the White House side of this equation. Jordan, thanks for joining this evening. Obviously, we heard from the president earlier, putting a lot of this on Donald Trump's shoulders. He also was asked, though, at the end of his remarks, whether or not this maybe changes the White House's decision or signal that they would veto a standalone Israel bill. Potentially, we could see a standalone Ukraine bill as well. How does this change the thinking on your end of Pennsylvania Avenue?
On the standalone Israel bill, I don't think it changes their calculus at all. Their stance the whole time is that this is a political stunt engineered by Speaker Mike Johnson to try and get around this conundrum he put himself in with the Ukrainian border package. And in fact, the president was pretty clear in his speech today that he's going to campaign on this. He's going to pin the blame on Donald Trump for tanking this package and saying that he cynically took advantage of this issue and doesn't want actual solutions. He wants it as a live ball to run on. So he said he's going to take that case to the American people. The White House didn't really preview any kind of legislative strategy. They've talked in the past about ways they can act themselves to get additional aid for Ukraine, but that's not going to measure up to what Congress could provide, the amount of money that Ukraine needs to continue this war against Russia.
Well, so should we believe that Joe Biden's maybe talking to Mitch McConnell here? Jordan, they were the two who wanted to see Ukraine funded, as well as our allies in Israel and Taiwan. Will a separate bill emerge, maybe as part of the government funding process in the next couple of weeks? What happens to this money that's left in the balance?
Yeah, Senator McConnell talked about that earlier, saying that they could move on the foreign aid aspects alone. But the math gets tough. Even if President Biden gets involved, even if they get a package through the Senate, the House remains a huge obstacle. Speaker Mike Johnson said the whole process of this negotiation that his members needed stronger border policy in order to vote on Ukraine. He then changed his position and said, actually, we don't need to pass a bill. The president can do border policy all on his own. So it's like sort of negotiating with Play-Doh. It's a kind of impossible position for the White House to be in. So I don't think they're too optimistic about anything getting through Congress at this point. So they can try different ways. They can try working with McConnell, but the frustration with Speaker Johnson is palpable.
Our thanks to Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian with us this evening on Balance of Power. As we turn now to Bloomberg's Sarah Forden for our third top story. It's been that kind of week and that kind of day here. Great to see you, Sarah. We got a ruling from the appellate court today in Washington when it comes to Donald Trump's claim of presidential immunity in this case that was set to tip off in March on attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election. What does this do now to the schedule, and does this actually strengthen Jack Smith's hand?
Absolutely. And this was a long-awaited opinion. For several weeks it's been hanging out there, and it came through very strongly worded, doesn't leave a lot of light for Trump's arguments. It's very dismissive of his positions. They give him 6 days to appeal to the Supreme Court, so the ruling is on hold until he does that. And then it's going to be up to the Supreme Court to decide, do they leave it to the appellate court and say you did great and this decision stands? Or is this such a momentous decision that they want to take it up and put their stamp on it?
Well, and how quickly would they decide to do so or actually make a ruling is the other question we have, knowing that it was just last week that the judge in this case, Judge Tanya Chutkin, canceled the original trial date of March 4th because we were awaiting this immunity decision. How quickly could we see a trial rescheduled, depending on what the Supreme Court decides to do here?
Well, the next series of events could potentially get the wheels moving very quickly. And the courts have been very much promoting moving this along and getting justice quickly. We don't see anybody dragging their feet here. The appellate court put it on an expedited schedule. So if the Supreme Court decides not to take it up, it could go right back to Chutkin and she could set a new trial date.
Well, we have a lot to learn still on this one as well. Sarah Forden, thank you. It's clearly been a busy day in the Washington Bureau, and glad you're sharing it with us. Coming up, Senator Mark Warner, chair of the Intelligence Committee, will join us live from Capitol Hill. That's next, A Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We had a very robust discussion about whether or not this product could ever become law. And it's been made pretty clear to us by the Speaker that it will not become law.
We are going to vote on the bill tomorrow, the bill that's been for us. We're going to move further forward. Stay tuned.
Senators Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, the leadership there earlier today on the fate of a bipartisan border bill that they both supported at one point. Let's bring in Senator Mark Warner, the Democrat from Virginia, is with us live from Capitol Hill, and appreciate your being with us on a very busy day, I know, Senator. It must be a confusing day. I know I'm not always the smartest, but I'm trying to figure out what happened here. And maybe you can tell me, was this the hand of Donald Trump, or was there a sticking point that we don't know about?
No. I mean, remember how we got here. Let's go way back in time, like 5 months ago. And the president said, we got to deal with the circumstance in Ukraine. We can't, and I 100% agree, we cannot walk away from Ukraine at this critical moment. We need to support our ally Israel. We need to provide more humanitarian aid to folks in that region. And we need to stand by Taiwan as we think about particularly the South China Sea. My Republican friends, almost to a person, said, you know what? We think some of that's important, but first things first, we got to deal with the border. And let me acknowledge the border's a mess, and it needs to be dealt with. So in a good faith effort, 3 senators went off, and they took a long time, 3 or 4 months, to craft a bill. But the bill they crafted literally had every Republican talking point. Every issue, amnesty, parole, more folks at the border, more beds, trying to cut down the flow, no more catch and release. Everything that was on the list was included in the bill. And then suddenly, Donald Trump starts tweeting out, and this priority of border is dropped. And, privately, I don't think I should be amazed by hypocrisy anymore, but even this took the cake. A lot of my Republican senators are horribly embarrassed, but you're right. What you've heard is they are walking away from the border provision, not because it's not what they wanted, not because it's not a good bill, but because it appears nobody wants to cross Donald Trump.
Well, and Senator, what we heard from President Biden speaking from the White House today was that he intends to make this known to voters, that if this fails, he says it fails because of Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans. But doesn't the fact remain that Democrats have had control of the Senate since 2021? Biden's been in the White House since 2021. Is this just an issue of Democrats not deciding to do something about this earlier when they had control?
I would put this, Kayleigh. There have been 3 immigration major reform efforts in the last 12 years. 2012 or 13 was one, 2014, I think, when the bipartisan bill came out of the Senate. Republicans in the House rejected it. 2018, there was an effort around Dreamers. Republicans rejected it. Yes, you can criticize these immigration bills are hard. The border bills are hard. That's why it took, intense negotiations for over 4 months. End of the day, a product was put together, and candidly, I feel a little bad for the Senate Republican leader. He supported it. James Lankford, a very, very conservative, someone selected by the Republicans to be their lead negotiator. He thought it was a good bill. Everything was moving along until the presumptive Republican nominee says, no, I don't really want to solve this problem. I want to use this as a campaign issue. So I think after tomorrow's vote, if Biden and Trump want to litigate that, I think the American public will reach a conclusion. Who put forward a plan that actually was bipartisan, that could have stopped the flow on the border? Who wants to use it as a political issue?
We heard from James Lankford today, again, the Republican negotiator at the table. The Oklahoma senator was asked about his reaction to the opposition of his colleagues here. Here's what he had to say, Senator.
I'm legitimately surprised at where we are at this moment, because as Republicans, we've done lots of press conferences at the border. We've had lots of conversations to say things have got to change. Now we get to this moment. I've got so many colleagues that are backing away. And that, I'm not saying it's all based on the political reasons. Some will have legitimate issues and say, hey, I don't like this part of the bill, or I wish there was more in it. But some are backing away also based on the politics of the moment.
I can't imagine what it's like to be Senator Lankford after going through all of this pain. But are we sure? I feel like I should start at the beginning, Senator Warner. Is this going to fail tomorrow? You do not have votes to get past this procedural hurdle.
and the remarkable thing, again, remember the procedural hurdle. No, we're not going to get the votes. The procedural hurdle would simply be, let's go debate the bill. So if some Republicans said, I don't like this number of how many border agents, I want 1,000 more. You got to get on the bill so you can try to offer an amendment. So, there are a number of Republicans, and one of the reasons the border is a mess, let me acknowledge that, but I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee. If we don't stand by Ukraine, Putin will win. And that will set back NATO. That will potentially put American troops in harm's way as Putin gets more aggressive around those NATO countries like the Baltic states. It is a national security disaster if we don't do that. If we don't step up both humanitarian and for support for Israel in the Middle East as we see our troops under assault and the Houthis trying to deal with the Red Sea, it will be a national security disaster. So there are important parts of this bill that still need to be considered, and whatever way we can get it done. I have a lot of Republicans now saying, well, I know I said I wanted border before, but now I really get the fact we got to help Ukraine. So can you bring back another version? And I think those are discussions going on right now.
Well, Senator, I'm glad you brought up the issues of not just Ukraine, but the Middle East and your chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee, as we are seeing continued strikes happening on U.S. forces from some of these Iranian proxies. Despite the strikes the U.S. has been conducting in return, it does not seem that our deterrence efforts are working. So what is our intelligence missing?
Well, it's not what our intelligence is missing. It's the fact that, these Shia groups have been supported by Iran for a long time, have been established in this region for some time, more than a decade. And I do think the president needs to strike back firmer against some of these groups. And I think he has decided that he will continue this campaign that's now been going on for 3 or 4 days. In terms of the Houthis in Yemen, this was a group, I was just in the region, this was a group that did receive assistance from Iran, no doubt about that. But they are pretty much independent actors at this point. And I am glad in this case we have the Brits and literally 8 or 9 other nation states who are trying to strike back against the Houthis. And I think they have, I again think we have to go against not just their missile launching installations, but their command and control. And 2 nights ago, I believe it was, we've ratcheted up. What we don't want to do, and this is again where I make a comparison to former President Trump, there was an incident where Iran shot down one of our major drones a number of years back. President Trump brought a number of us in the national security field to the White House. He basically said, well, he was going to go ahead and attack Iran. At the end of the day, he decided not to, because that might have engulfed the whole region in a war, and it would even be more so at this moment in time. And he's decided, as a commander-in-chief, has the right to do a time and place to strike back. And ultimately, he killed General Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Quds forces, but he took him out in Baghdad, not inside of Iran.
Senator Warner, there's been some criticism, though, that 4 to 5 days of telegraphing might have made these strikes less effective, as Iranian-backed groups, members of the Revolutionary Guard, were able to get out of the way in time. Do you wish the president had acted sooner?
Listen, I'm not going to micromanage which day. I know there was one day, I think there was even some weather concerns in terms of being able to launch. But I do think and this is a time where I think Joe Biden's 40 years plus of experience, we need, because having been, again, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, and Israel, literally within the last 4 weeks, the last thing anyone in that region wants is a further expansion of this war. That doesn't help Israel. It obviously doesn't help those more Sunni allies that we have, like Jordan or the Emirates or Bahrain, or even as we try to reach some accord with Saudi Arabia for a closer alliance. A wider war at this moment in time with the already existing conflict in Gaza is not good for America's national security or for our allies.
All right, Senator Mark Warner, the Democrat from Virginia and chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. We appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, guys.
Now, coming up, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen earlier was testifying before the House Financial Services Committee. We'll have some highlights next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Over the past 3 years, the Biden administration has driven an historic recovery. GDP growth is strong and inflation has declined significantly. We've also achieved a healthy labor market.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen testifying earlier today before the House Financial Services Committee, talking, Joe, about the strength the administration sees in the economy. That said, she did talk about some risks out there that she's monitoring, specifically when it comes to commercial real estate and the impact that could have on banks, keeping New York Community Bank Corp top of mind here. She said that they're monitoring current banking stresses carefully, but overall definitely trying to paint a more upbeat picture about the economic outlook. Yeah,
this was an annual bit of testimony about what Washingtonians like you call the FSOC.
Financial Stability Oversight Council.
That's part of the jargon here. And, of course, lawmakers wanted to talk about everything other than that. Her job kind of was not to make news today, right? The New York Community Bank Corp came up, no direct comment on that. So she got out, apparently, with the plan intact. Yeah, but that does not mean that all of these lawmakers necessarily agreed with the picture that she was painting. Well, sure. And there was some goading going on, as you might suspect, in a hearing like this. We heard from lawmakers following Treasury Secretary Yellen's testimony. Let's watch.
Ask the American people. They will tell you they're feeling their pocketbooks. She said inflation is under control. Yes, it's been lowered, but that doesn't solve the problems this country has.
When you look at what we have for unemployment, when you look at where inflation is, remember, we were struggling with a global COVID epidemic. We were going through a lot of things cleaning up from the last administration. And so I am very hopeful.
Interest rates are keeping young people everybody from buying homes, buying cars. Everything's more expensive. And people are running up their credit cards.
Wall Street's, aside from maybe the last day or two, has shown a very upbeat picture. And in fact, when stocks are going down, it's because employment is up. And so I think the economy's moving in the right direction. People will feel it in a few months.
So a lot of views there on the economy, but interesting to hear Congressman Musser talking about interest rates specifically, because often members of Congress like to chime in on Fed policy, except for maybe Democratic Congressman Jim Himes. This is what he told Bloomberg earlier.
Where I stand on rate cuts is where every member of Congress should stand on rate cuts, which is they should shut the hell up. There's a reason why we have an independent monetary policy, and that is to be insulated from the tender mercies of people like me.
It's kind of refreshing, actually, when you think about it. Maybe members of the administration should say that instead of talking about an independent Fed. But look, it brings us back to this testimony from Janet Yellen. No victory lap on avoiding a recession on the soft landing. And we'll hear from her again on Thursday. She'll be before the Senate Banking Committee. Coming up, former President Trump denied immunity in his election case today. We'll have that next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Donald Trump is continuing to campaign for the presidency, a second go at it. But today, the appellate court ruled that he is not above the law as a former president, rejecting his immunity in the 2020 election case. Let's bring in now former federal prosecutor and law professor at Cardozo Law School, Jessica Roth. So, Jessica, thank you so much for joining the program. Essentially, what these judges here in Washington have said is that former President Trump is now citizen Trump, that if he made this immunity argument that he is actually immune from prosecution, that would effectively do away with the separation of powers, making him out of reach of all three branches of government. He now, though, has 6 days to appeal this to the Supreme Court. How would you expect that the High Court would handle this matter?
Well, this is a historic opinion that was issued today, and it was a resounding rejection of Trump's claim of immunity from criminal prosecution. It's an extremely well-written, thorough, well-reasoned opinion, and it speaks unanimously on behalf of a panel that included one Republican-appointed judge, speaking in one clear, calm voice and holding that the former president is not above the law. The fact that it is such a well-reasoned and well-written opinion suggests to me that the Supreme Court might consider not taking up the issue. This is a thorough opinion that addresses every single one of the arguments that former President Trump had raised. And I don't see any reason why the Supreme Court would necessarily take up this case except for the fact that it is such a historic matter, the first ruling ever by an appellate court on a former president's claim of immunity from criminal prosecution. And because of the significance of the issue, that is probably the best reason for the court to strongly consider taking up the case.
Wow. All right. So that's important, Jessica. If the Supreme Court does not take up this case, what does that mean for timing potentially of a trial? We had this on the docket for the beginning of March. Where would it then land?
So it all depends on how quickly the U.S. Supreme Court decides whether it's going to take the case or not. If it just decides immediately upon receiving the former president's application, which we expect he will file on Monday, then it would go immediately back to the trial court to set a new trial date. That trial date had been March 4th, but there are still about 3 months left in the calendar that the trial judge had set for pretrial motions to be considered. And so if the court were to sort of restart the matter immediately, say at the end of February, then we'd be looking at a trial that would be starting probably in the beginning of June.
Okay, so that potentially could be before the Republican convention and well before the election in November, which we know, depending on whether or not Trump is convicted of a felony by that point, it could change the way a lot of voters make their decision, which is why we keep this timeline in mind. Just to go, though, to the argument that the former president has made, he suggests that essentially this sets bad precedent because it means that whoever is in the Oval Office, as soon as they leave, the opposition party is going to indict them, going to go after them, going to try to prosecute them. Do you not share any of those concerns about precedent here?
So one of the arguments that he made is that this would essentially open the floodgates to prosecution by political opponents as soon as a president left office. And I do think that that is probably the most serious concern here. But that said, what the D.C. Circuit said is that they haven't seen any history of that happen. This is the first time that we've had a prosecution brought of a former president, and that there are checks in place to ensure that prosecutors don't bring charges that are unfounded. They talked about, for example, the ethical rules that bind prosecutors, so they can't bring a case that is not founded or that is based on political motivations. There's also the check provided by a grand jury of ordinary citizens who have to hear the preliminary evidence in a case and decide whether there's probable cause to go forward and issue an indictment. And so those are the kinds of checks on prosecutors bringing criminal charges that don't exist with respect to civil lawsuits brought by private litigants. Now, previously, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized a doctrine of immunity for presidents for official acts committed in office against civil suits brought for against them for official acts taken in office. And one of the concerns that the Supreme Court cited in recognizing immunity from civil lawsuits was this prospect of essentially floodgates of civil litigation. And what the D.C. Circuit said here is that we just don't see that same prospect with respect to criminal prosecutions.
It's believed with this ruling today, at least by many, you can tell us if you agree, that it's possible if this trial is delayed and as we wait for a Supreme Court ruling or a higher appellate court, that Alvin Bragg's case, the hush money case, could actually be the first to be tried against Donald Trump this year. And a lot of folks have gone out of their way to try to delegitimize that particular case. I spoke about it with Nick Ackerman today, who's a former assistant U.S. attorney. He was a former Watergate prosecutor, and he strongly disagreed with that characterization. I'd love for you to listen to what he said and have you respond.
What this case has to do with is Donald Trump defrauding the U.S. voting public in 2016. What he did was he engaged in a scheme that involved not just himself, but David Pecker at the National Enquirer and others, including his own attorney. This situation, if it had been released prior to the election, probably would have resulted in Hillary Clinton being elected.
It's a pretty strong statement. Jessica Roth, I wonder if you agree with it and if indeed that might be the first trial to be had now.
Well, depending on what happens with how quickly the U.S. Supreme Court decides whether or not to take up Trump's appeal of the D.C. Circuit opinion, it may well be that the Manhattan District Attorney case will be the first one to go to trial. There are, however, remaining legal issues to be adjudicated in that case that could push that one over as well while the courts decide those novel questions. There's no question that in comparison to the cases brought by the special counsel, particularly the January 6th case that was the subject of this D.C. Circuit opinion, the charges of the Manhattan District Attorney's case are less serious. They don't involve a direct threat to democracy and overturning the results of an election in 2020. But they are significant charges, and they do date back to the 2016 election. They involve allegations that the former president falsified business records at the Trump organization to cover up payments that were made in order to keep a former mistress silent about their affair. And the allegation is that the former president concealed those payments in his business records in order to increase his chances of being elected, on the theory that if the public knew about the affair, they would be less likely to vote for him. Those are significant charges, and we need to wait and see how the evidence unfolds in terms of who the witnesses are that the district attorney's office will put forward to support those allegations, to ultimately make a decision on the strength of the evidence in that case.
Jessica, thanks for being with us on another important day here. Jessica Roth here on Balance of Power. Coming up next is presidential primary day in Nevada. We'll be explaining a confusing situation next on Balance of Power and on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. The Nevada Republican primary is today. Maybe you didn't hear about it. While the party is set to hold its caucus in the state on Thursday. Might not have heard about that either. Helping us explain the situation now is Bloomberg's Julie Fine. It's getting more confusing as we go here, Julie. You gave us a bit of background on this when we were in New Hampshire. Why the two separate contests?
Well, we can straighten this all out. There are two separate contests because the state essentially passed a law calling for a primary, but the Republicans still wanted to have a caucus. So there's a for the Republicans, there's a primary and a caucus. Democrats just have a primary. But here's the catch. If you run in the caucus for Republicans, you can't run in the primary. If you run in the primary, you can't run in the caucus. And all the delegates are awarded in the caucus. So the bottom line is for Republicans, there's a primary and a caucus. The winner comes from the caucus. Nikki Haley's in the primary. The former president, Donald Trump, is in the caucus. So he stands to get the delegates here.
Okay, so it seems like we already know how this is going to shake out. Trump gets all the delegates in Nevada, which raises the question, Julie, as to whether or not the state of Nevada even matters. Can it tell us things aside from the delegate count?
I mean, I think it can tell you things in terms of polling as well. I mean, we were there when we talked to a lot of voters. I mean, they're really concerned about the economy in Nevada, for instance. This is a big union state. You have the Culinary Workers of America there. So I think we may be able to see some trends there. But even though this system has really made this very uneventful in terms of what is going to happen, the big deal here, of course, is the general election. And even though Nevada doesn't have that many electoral votes, it's extremely important because, like Arizona, it really can swing an election. So I think that both of the parties will be looking here for trends, seeing who's voting, how many people are voting, and what is most important to them, especially when they're crafting their messages.
All right, Bloomberg's Julie Fine, thank you so much. I'd be interested to see what turnout looks like as well, because why would you show up to vote in a primary if you know that no delegates are even
now they both
up for
get
grabs?
to claim victory.
Right.
That won't confuse anyone either.
Certainly confuses me a little bit. So let's dive deeper into this now. Joining us around the table is our political panel. With us this evening, we have Lester Munson, International BGR Government Affairs Principal, and Caitlin Legacki, Partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. So Lester, I'll pose to you the same question I posed to Julie. What's the point of Nevada? What will it tell us, if anything at all?
Well, who turns out? Who's willing to go out and vote? You know, our wonderful political consultant professional class is going to be able to discern patterns and trends in that data. And we can kind of talk about crosstabs and whatnot of exit polls and things like that. So It does seem kind of pointless on the surface, I agree, but perhaps we can discern some important voter information when we dig down deep into the numbers.
We do like data here at Bloomberg. So.
Well, that's true, and we will do that. Nikki Haley is I guess planning for a good night as she essentially stands alone on the ballot. She requested Secret Service protection today because the threats have become too much against her and her family. She said, quote, "We've had multiple issues. It's not going to stop me." I guess she's in through South Carolina, which a lot of folks had been wondering.
Yeah.
What a time this must be for her to be up against MAGA Inc. In a campaign that a lot of people are looking at as a general election.
Yeah, I mean, she, I think, had to know going into this that if she was looking for a one-on-one rematch or a one-on-one contest against Donald Trump, she was going to get the entire kitchen sink thrown at her, both by him and by his followers. But it's a really sorry commentary on the state of our politics that, you know, she's getting that many death threats. But, you know, I think one of the things that Lester said that's most important is seeing who turns out for Nikki Haley in Nevada will be critically important for the general election, but also the Senate race in Nevada. You know, if I were working on either of those races, I'd be looking at who are those independent voters, but also what does Hispanic turnout look like? How many Hispanic voters are going to Republican caucuses and primaries? And using that as kind of a canary in the coal mine to see how things are looking for November and where we need to shore things up.
Well, as you say, right now, it is assumed that in November it's going to be Joe Biden versus former President Trump, although Nikki Haley is still trying to fight it out with him at the moment. On the subject of the former president, Lester, we, of course, began our day with news from the appellate court here in Washington. Judges ruling that he is not immune from prosecution in the 2020 election interference case brought by Jack Smith. If you listen to the former president, he says that, A, a president needs immunity, also that this is just part of the witch hunt, et cetera. And he immediately sent out a fundraising email about this. Does this news today have the same effect of all the indictments and all of the other legal trials and tribulations before it, which it just strengthens his position as the front runner?
I don't think so. I think this is going to give some oxygen to Nikki Haley's campaign. The Republican convention's in the middle of July. This case, it looks like there's an argument that this case may start, the trial may start in early June. So if she can somehow sustain her operation through the next few months, and there's a long road to go, and Super Tuesday looms, but if she can keep things alive to the convention, who knows what's going to happen in an actual court of law where the former president is being judged by a jury of D.C. voters. There are a lot of wild cards to be played here in this poker game.
So, Caitlin, in that case, then, we just strengthen the argument for the just hang in there strategy. That's really what this campaign is, right? I'm here. I've got a couple delegates. If the big guy goes down, I'll be ready.
I think that's right. And, you know, I think it's wise, especially because it sets her up to be the front runner in 2028. And the worst case scenario is that she comes in a strong second and she has built a chance to build the relationships and the fundraising network nationally that she would need for that. So I think it's a win-win for her in that respect, even though the odds are very much against her in terms of actually winning this primary.
Well, and when we think about these legal considerations specifically, we know even per Bloomberg's own polling that we've conducted with Morning Consult, voters change their minds if Trump is actually convicted of a crime. I believe 53% of the swing state voters we polled in 7 states said they would not vote for him in that case, 55% if he actually goes to prison. But it comes down to a timeline question and whether close enough to the election, if it's Trump versus Biden, people still feel that way if you have Biden as your alternative, Caitlin.
Well, I think one of the most important polling things we've seen recently is that the vast majority of American voters are not paying attention right now, and they don't actually believe that it will be Trump and Biden running against each other. And so as that permeates more into the American consciousness, and as people start paying attention more closely, the fact that he will be convicted, presumably if the case is brought, I think will have a real effect. And, you know, the thing about the American people is they just don't like chaos. And Biden running against Trump in a scenario where he's just been convicted really underscores the level of chaos that he will bring, but also, you know, if he gets reelected, all bets are off, and he's got carte blanche.
All right, coming up on Balance of Power, Joe Biden is blaming Donald Trump for sinking the border bill, and he's not the only one pointing the finger.
If there's two words that describe why this, one of the most important pieces of legislation to come before us in a very long time, failed, it is Donald Trump. And second, it's the inability of Republican congressmen and senators to resist his bullying.
It's an unmitigated disaster they've created. Now they somehow wrap it all up in a nice gift package, and with some legislative language that has absolutely no teeth to it whatsoever. Okay, still leaves it to the discretion of Mayorkas and Joe Biden. Why would we cooperate with a political victory for them?
That was Republican Representative Dan Muser of Pennsylvania earlier today. Back with us now, our political panel on Bloomberg TV and radio, Lester Munson, International BGR Government Affairs Principal, and Caitlin Legacki, Partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. So, Lester, we have been asking the question as to how exactly all of this fell apart when Republicans seem to be getting exactly what they said they wanted. Now they just don't. President Biden, speaking at the White House today, said this is down to one man, and that is Donald Trump. How true is that?
I think it's 100% true, and it does say something profound about the former president's hold on the Republican caucus, not just in the House, where we kind of knew that, but also now in the Senate. And I think the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, was signaling this last week when he said, hey, I'm not so sure about the politics here. He can count votes better than anyone in town. And I think he had a pretty good sense a few days ago where this thing was going. It is a profound thing that we have seen today, I think.
Profound, indeed. What are your thoughts on this, Caitlin? Because it's been suggested by the president, even Jim Lankford, I think, the Republican chief negotiator, that this is it. This is your chance.
Yeah, and I think for all of us who believe that Washington should be able to work together and find compromise, it's really concerning that, really principled, strong members from each party in the Senate negotiated a bill. We get, Democrats believe they gave Republicans everything they asked for, and now, the goalposts aren't being moved; they're being taken out of the ground. Like, there are no goalposts anymore. And so, the worst thing you can say to a Senate person is that they're turning into the House, but that's really what's happening as more members of the Senate Republican Conference kind of follow the lead of Donald Trump on this.
Well, and in the House, you have a speaker in Mike Johnson and even Kevin McCarthy before that who really struggled to keep his conference together. And I wonder if we're now, Lester, starting to see the same thing of the minority leader, Mitch McConnell. He wanted this deal. He has been pushing for Ukraine aid. And even members of his leadership team have now turned against him on this. How effective can he be as a leader going forward?
Well, it's going to be a huge struggle. I think I don't want to say something that gets me in trouble here, but I think the root cause of this issue here is actually the political weakness of the president. His polling is so bad now that Republicans can get away with this kind of behavior and still be in the lead, and trying to shut him down from any kind of political victory. They're able to do that now because he hasn't demonstrated the political strength he needs to guide Congress to go get a big legislative package.
Will we still see Republicans go to the border throughout this election year to hold news conferences while migrants are wading through the river behind them?
It's always a good image for them because, certain other channels are going to show that regardless.
How does that still work if you voted no on the bill that you wanted?
Republicans can fairly make the point, look, for the last 2 years, this problem was because of President Biden and his policies. That is a fair point for them to make. What they have to answer for, I think, is, well, why didn't you adopt a legislative solution when Democrats were willing to compromise with you? But because the president is weak, I don't think they're going to have to make that case.
Caitlin, just finally, we only have about a minute left, but the House is now voting on that standalone Israel aid package, more than $17 billion. Should Democrats now be willing to pass things one by one, Israel and maybe Ukraine after that?
No, I think that the president has been correct. The Democratic Senate caucus has been correct that we need to vote on these things together. That was the deal in the first place. The only reason we're talking about this immigration bill is because that was a contingency to get Israel and Ukraine aid. So I think Republicans really need to stick to their word and vote on these things together.
Our thanks to Caitlin Legacki and Lester Munson. A smart conversation, as always. Thank you both for dealing with a sensitive topic with grace. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Well, we may actually know the vote count on this Israel package and the impeachment of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas as well. We'll continue having that covered for you on Bloomberg TV and radio.